Good. Okay, Rabbi, we're on DAF Yud Gimel Amud Aleph at the Mishnah, several lines down, maybe about 18, 19 lines down. The Mishnah is talking about, we're in Zechus Moed Katan, so it's nice to join you, 13 blot into, thanks. Yeah. So anyway, Mishnah says, talking about the laws of Chol HaMoed. I got a camera from the... Ein lo chinbatim avadum ubehema elo letzarach hamoed o letzarach hamocher she'ein lo ma yochal. So purchases, commercial trade is not permitted during Chol HaMoed, and the specific examples that the Mishnah gives are buying real estate, houses, servants, and animals. However, if it's for the needs of the Moed, if you need to make a purchase of an animal, let's say you need to shecht it for the needs of the Moed, so then it's permitted. Another justification for purchases on Chol HaMoed would be for the purpose of the seller. Let's say I don't need the animal, but I see that there's a guy who has an animal, he has no food in his house, and the only thing that he can get money from is the sale of his animal. I'm allowed to buy his animal so that he can have money, what to have for Chol HaMoed. Okay, so that's permitted. She'ein lo ma yochal, that he doesn't have food to eat. So the Gemara now says, Ba'minei Rava me Rav Nachman, schar pe'ula she'ein lo ma yochal mahu. So they asked, so Rava asked Rav Nachman, what about paying someone his wages as a laborer? Are you allowed to pay someone his wages as a laborer if he doesn't have what to eat? In other words, I could really get by without having this guy do work for me on Chol HaMoed. But I see that if I don't hire him, he's not going to have food to eat. Am I allowed to hire him? Now you could always ask, well, why not just give him money? Just give him tzedakah. Well, no, that's not an option for people who don't want to take tzedakah. So the only way he's going to have food is if I hire him. Can I hire him? We know that you're allowed to purchase things from such a person. Can you hire him and pay him wages? What? What do you mean it's Sarach HaRabim?
By hiring him, you're actually making him not dependent on other people for tzedakah.
I'm not sure if that qualifies as Tzarech Rabim. That's not really the classic definition of Tzarech Rabim is when we can justify doing something for the needs of the community. That's not a community need to save people money. But here's an argument that this guy needs to eat on Chol HaMoed. So is that enough of a justification to pay him wages? Amar leitanina ulitzarech hamocher shein lo mo yachol. So he says, well, look, Rav Nachman says it's a Mishnah. The Mishnah says that you can give someone money, you can buy something from a seller for the needs of the seller. And then it adds the explicit words that he doesn't have what to eat. That he doesn't have what to eat. So la suye mai. Why did you need to say the words that he doesn't have what to eat? Just say that it's for the needs of the seller, and that's implicit that he needs food. So lav la asuye schar peula. Doesn't that come to add and say that it's not only when the person who you want to support is selling something, but even if he's working and he wants to get paid his wages? So Amar Leilo, Prushika Mefaresh. So Rava said, not necessarily. You can't adduce from those extra words that the Mishnah is telling me an additional halacha. It may just be coming to explain, what does it mean that it's for the needs of the seller? What do you mean the seller needs the money? The answer is that he doesn't have food to eat. So that you understand that it's a dire situation. It's not just that he needs cash so that he can pad his account. So Eisvei Abaye. So Abaye brings another brisa. He says, Ein kos v'in shtori chov b'moed. Vim eno ma'amino, o she'en lo ma'yochal hareze yichtov, period. That you're not allowed to write legal notes on Chol HaMoed. The specific example is promissory notes. You can't write an IOU on Chol HaMoed. Vim eno ma'amino, but if the lender does not trust the borrower, he says, I'm happy to lend you money, but I need a signed promissory note. So then you're allowed to have the sofer write a note, even though normally you're not supposed to write legal documents on Chol HaMoed. Oh, she'ein lo ma yochal. Or if the scribe doesn't have what to eat, so then that's another justification for hiring someone. In other words, the lender trusts the borrower, but there's a sofer who is making himself available to write promissory notes and legal documents, and he doesn't have food because he doesn't have a parnasa. So you can hire him, and that's perfectly fine. Raizel yichtov. So she'en lo ma yochel la asuye mai. So what are those words coming to include? Lav la asuye schar peula shma mina. There, it's clear that the person that you want to hire is a laborer, and you're allowed to pay him his wages in order to give him something to eat. Because otherwise, what is she'en lo ma yochal referring to? It's not referring to the borrower, right? Because you already said if you don't trust him, you can write it. So it must be referring to the scribe. The scribe doesn't have what to eat. And therefore, you see from here, Abaye basically proves from this brisa to answer Rabbi's original question. Yes, the answer is you are allowed to pay someone their wages if that's the way they're going to be able to have food on Chol HaMoed. So Mosif Rav Sheshes v'Chachamim Omrim Shalosh Umnios Osin Melacha Ba'arvei Psachim Ad Chatzos. So Rav Sheshes challenges the whole premise. He says, look, I want to show you a brisa which says that there's a correlation that is made between work that you're allowed to do on Erev Pesach and work that you're allowed to do on Chol HaMoed. And this is the premise of Rav Sheshes' question, is that based on the correlation that the brisa makes, once you permit to pay someone who needs food, to pay them their wages, then the brisa doesn't make any sense. And let's see what he means. He says there are three types of occupations or professions that even though normally all work is not permitted on Erev Pesach, but the following three are allowed to do work until Chatzos on Erev Pesach. HaChayotin, v'hasaforim, v'hakovsim. And the three are tailors, barbers, and launderers. They're allowed to take care of business on Erev Pesach only until Chatzos. And look at now at the correlation that the brisa makes. Why is it that a tailor is allowed to work on Erev Pesach? Because we find that tailors, there's a certain kind of tailor work that can be done during Chol HaMoed under certain circumstances. If it's non-professional in nature, meaning that it's a type of stitch that even a non-professional can do, you're allowed to do it on Chol HaMoed. Hasaforim v'hakovsim shekein habon mimedinas hayam v'hayotzim mibeis ha'asurim mutarim l'sarper l'chabis b'chol shel moed. And similarly, the reason why getting a haircut and doing laundry is permitted on Erev Pesach is because we know that under certain circumstances, those activities can be performed on Chol HaMoed, such as we'll learn in the next parak, that if a person comes from a faraway place, he was on a boat before Yantav and didn't have a chance to do laundry or get a haircut, or he just got out of jail and he couldn't do laundry or get a haircut because he was in prison, so then he's allowed to do the work on Chol HaMoed. So since these activities can be justified on Chol HaMoed under certain limited circumstances, we therefore permit you to do them until Chatzos on Erev Pesach. So Rav Sheshes' question is based on that correlation that the brisa makes. V'isal gadaitach schar peula she'en lo ma yoichal shari kol malachos nami lishtaru dahika schar peula she'en lo ma yoichal. He says, you just told me that any kind of wage can be paid for a laborer on Chol HaMoed if the guy doesn't have food to eat. So you see that under limited circumstances, every job can be performed on Chol HaMoed, not just laundry and haircuts, but any job. Like a dentist can fill teeth if he needs the money. A lawyer can do lawyer work, right? Everyone is allowed to work on Chol HaMoed if they need the money. So why does the brisa only limit itself on Erev Pesach to these three activities if you can justify in Chol HaMoed any labor? So Maskef lo Rav Papa elameata binyan lishteri. So Rav Papa challenges Rav Sheshes' line of reasoning. He says we should even permit construction according to that brisa that you just brought, which correlates these two. We should permit construction on Erev Pesach. Shekein kaisel hagoel l'rishus harabim soser ubona kedarko mipnei hasakana. He says because we know that under certain limited circumstances you can even demolish and reconstruct a wall on Chol HaMoed. If you have a wall that is dangerously protruding into or hanging over into Rishus Harabim and you're worried that people are going to get injured by it or it's going to collapse and fall on people, you're allowed to demolish it and rebuild it on Chol HaMoed. So you see, if all you're doing is saying that the brisa creates a correlation between sometimes you're allowed, under limited circumstances you can do this on Chol HaMoed, so you can always do it on Erev Pesach, then even building projects should be permitted on Erev Pesach. And Maskef lo Ravina, similarly, Ravina asks, and similarly, you should be able to, ascribal work also should always be allowed to be done on Erev Pesach, because on Chol HaMoed, under limited circumstances, we're allowed to have a scribe work, because we know that a scribe is allowed to write, a kesuva is allowed to write a get on Chol HaMoed. If a woman needs to get married and she gets divorced, we don't push it off. We let her get, we take care of business right away. So essentially, what these two rabbis are arguing is that Rav Sheshis, your understanding of the Brisa is mistaken. Because if all the Brisa is doing is creating a correlation between these two, between Chol HaMoed under limited circumstances, gives you a carte blanche to always do it on Erev Pesach, then you're right, everything would be permitted, and that's obviously not the case. Ela Amar Ravashi, Moed Arbas or Karamis. You're really comparing apples and oranges. The Brisa didn't mean to create an absolute correlation between the two. Moed mishum tirchahu v'makom peseda shara rabbanan. He says, when do we permit you to do work on Chol HaMoed? The rabbis, all the limitations on Chol HaMoed are midirabanan. Midiraisa, you can do regular work on Chol HaMoed. Midirabanan, they wanted to limit your amount of exertion, so you should stay focused on the holy day. And therefore, they said anything that's exertion, you should not do on Chol HaMoed. So, but if there's a financial loss involved, so then the rabbis suspended that restriction. So when a guy's going to lose money, or a guy doesn't have food to eat, so they let you work so that you'll have what to eat, or that you won't lose money. Arbas or mishum tzarach yom tovu. Midid tzarach yom tov shar rabbanan. Midid alav tzarach yom tov lo shar rabbanan. What activities did the rabbis permit on Erev Pesach? Only those things that need to be done for the sake of Pesach. So they only permitted that. The Brisa doesn't mean to tell you have a carte blanche on Erev Pesach to do anything that is conceivably permitted to do on Chol HaMoed. No, only those things that you need for the yontif itself, like the laundry and a haircut, and and taking a bath and things like that, or a tailor, right? Those are the things that you can do because of L'tzarach HaMoed. Anything that's not L'tzarach HaMoed, even though there's that you're not, those malachas you're not allowed to do. You can't. The two don't correlate in the way that you were trying to make the correlation. So therefore, just because when there's a hefsid involved, you're allowed to do plenty of different things on Chol HaMoed, doesn't automatically mean you could do them on Erev Pesach as well.
And Moed is the Raizel, and Erev Pesach is Midrabanan. So Moed has a stronger. Chol
HaMoed, what's the D'oraisa by Chol HaMoed? The Rabbanan, the Gemara also points out that Chol HaMoed is the Rabbanan as well. Yeah. Mishnah now says, Ein mefanin mibayas labayas, avol mefanahu lachatzero. So the Mishnah says that you're not allowed to transfer utensils, like furniture and the like. You can't schlep things from one house to another because you're not allowed to do any public signs of exertion. But you are allowed to move it from your house to your courtyard. Ein mevi'in kelim mibeis ha'uman. And similarly, you're not allowed to schlep utensils out of the shopkeeper's shop. Let's say you had brought something to be fixed to the shopkeeper, or you brought clothing to be cleaned at the dry cleaner. You can't pick those up on Chol HaMoed. But if, however, you're worried that by leaving them by the professional, they're going to get stolen because he puts up a big sign saying not responsible for theft, and he leaves the shop unlocked, so then you can bring them to another courtyard where they'll be secure. The Gemara now says, "Ve'ha'amart reisha ein mefanim klal." So let's go to the first line of the Mishnah. Let's go back to that. It says you're not allowed to move things from one house to another, but you are allowed to move it from your house to the chutzner. It sounded from the first part that you can't move it out of the house at all because someone's going to see it and it's going to look like you're doing exertion, you're doing tircha on Chol HaMoed. So how can you then tell me in the same breath that you're allowed to move it from the house to the chutzner? So Amar Abayis Seifa Asan L'Bayis Shebechutzner. So what we're talking about in the Seifa is that you are allowed to move something as long as it's in a private courtyard. You can move it from one house to a chutzner. But to move it from a house to another house, even if it sounds like, from Rashi, even if it's in the same chutzner, so then that's already too much of a demonstrative act of exertion, and therefore we don't permit it. Okay? Rashi in the Mishnah seems to be saying, that it's the Gemara's Havamina was that you're allowed to schlep from a house outside your chutzner into your chutzner, and that's what we're not permitting. What the Gemara in the Maskon is not permitting is shifting from one chutzner to another. Within the same chutzner, it sounds like it's permitted, and it could be even from one house to the other in the same chutzner. It's a little bit ambiguous, but that's what it sounds like from Rashi.
People moving chairs into sukkahs all the time on Chol Moed from different people's houses.
Yeah. So you'd have to be able to justify that it's l'tzarach hamoed, and you weren't able to do it from before. But
where do you draw the line?
It's very difficult to draw the line, but you have to limit it in whatever way possible. That's the way. That's what the poskim try to liberate. Chol Moed is very complicated because it's so nondescript. In other words, the laws are midrabanan, and the rabbis basically said, "Don't do anything you don't need to do." That's exertion. That has an exertion involved to it. Ve'ein mevi'in kelim mibeis ha'uman, and you're not allowed to bring utensils from the shopkeeper, from the professional. Amar Rav Papa Bodiklon Rava Tanan Ein Mevi'in Kelim Mibeis Ha'uman or a Minu. So Rav Papa gave us a farher. He says, Rava gave us a farher. Rav Papa says that Rava gave us, meaning I and my fellow students, he gave us a farher. He tested us. He said, look, it says in the Mishnah that you're not allowed to pick things up from the shopkeeper's shop. And yet it says in the Brisa that you're allowed to take things and pick up things from the shopkeeper's shop, even if they're not for the needs of Chol Moed. So how do you reconcile the Brisa with the Mishnah? We answered him. We gave him two answers. The first answer we gave him is that the Brisa is not talking about Chol Moed; it's talking about Erev Pesach. And even though on Erev Pesach you're not allowed to do acts of exertion, but to pick things up from the shopkeeper, though that you are allowed to do. And we gave him a second answer. It could also be that the Brisa, when it says you are allowed to pick things up from the shopkeeper and drop things off, is talking about when you don't trust the shopkeeper to keep things secure in his shop. And the Mishnah is talking about when you do trust him, when the things will be secure. The Hatanya, as the Brisa points out, Mevi'in Kelim mi beis ha'uman kegon kad mi beis ha'kador v'kos mi beis ha'sagag avalo tzer mi beis ha'tzava v'lo kelim mi beis ha'uman. That the Brisa talks about, first the Brisa draws an important distinction which is really tangential to our discussion. And that is that when are you allowed to pick things up from the shopkeeper? When it's clearly indicated from the nature of the item that you're picking up that it's l'tzarach hamoed, that it's for the purpose of the yontif. So, for example, you can pick up small jugs and glasses from a professional glass blower or a jug maker. That's perfectly fine because it's clear, it's self-evident. Anyone who's watching you is saying, "Oh, he needs glasses for his yontif suda." So therefore, even on Chol Moed, that's okay. It could be that's the same case with the chairs, Rabbi Black. But avolot semer b'beis hatzava, what you're not allowed to pick up from the shop is you cannot pick up dyed wool and you cannot pick up larger utensils. Because there it's not indicated, it's not self-evident that you're doing it for the tzarach hamoed. V'me'ein lo ma'yochal no sense lo scharo u'manicho etzlo. Let's say the shopkeeper wants you to pick up the goods because he wants to be paid, and normally it's COD. So therefore, if you don't pick it up, he doesn't get paid. So no. You know what? You tell him, I'm going to pay you. I'll pay you now, but I want you to keep it at the shop because it's Chol Moed. I'm not supposed to do any exertion, anything that's conspicuous on Chol Moed, and that's fine. V'me'eno ma'amino. But if you don't trust the shopkeeper to keep things secure in his shop, manicho b'vayis hasamuchlo, then you're allowed to schlep it out of his shop in order to put it to an adjacent area that is secure. V'mchoshesh lahem shem yigonvu mevi'in b'tzina b'soch beso. But if even an adjacent area is not secure, then you can bring it all the way back to your house as long as you do it privately and not conspicuously. So the Gemara says, you see from this brisa that when you don't trust the shopkeeper because he's not going to keep things secure, then you're allowed to pick it up. And that would be the difference between the Mishnah, which says that you're not allowed to pick things up on Chol Moed, and the Brisa, which says that you are allowed to pick things up. So the Gemara says, now wait a minute, that's not going to help us completely, because Taratz the Mevi'in, Molichin Kasha, the Katani Ein Mevi'in, V'kol Shekein Shein Molichin. Now let's go back to the language of the Brisa. Remember the Brisa that Rava had challenged the students with was, it says that Molichin Umevi'in, you're allowed to both bring things to the shopkeeper and pick things up from the shopkeeper on Chol Moed. So fine, you explained that picking things up, why are you allowed to pick things up from the shopkeeper in Chol HaMoed? Because of security issues. He's not going to watch over them. But that only answers picking things up. Where would the heter ever be to bring things to the shopkeeper on Chol HaMoed? You can't argue that you're worried about security. That's why you're bringing it to the shopkeeper. That's nonsensical. You'd only be allowed to pick things up from the shopkeeper because you're worried he's not going to watch it. You don't bring things to him because you're worried he's not going to watch it. So the Gemara says, "Ela machvarta kedushanyon meikara." So the Gemara says, you're right. Really, the second answer is no good. We have to revert back to the first answer. That whole brayso is not even talking about Chol HaMoed. It's talking about Erev Pesach, and we're more lenient on what you're allowed to do conspicuously in Erev Pesach than what you're allowed to do on Chol HaMoed. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. Mechapen es haketzios bekash, and Reb Yehuda Omer af me'avin. Here's another exertion activity that you're allowed to do on Chol HaMoed. You're drying out your fruits, like your dates or your figs, on the rooftop on Chol HaMoed, and all of a sudden, the clouds are coming, the dark clouds, it's about to rain. So you're allowed to take hay or straw and put a layer of hay or straw as a protective cover to protect it from the rainfall. That you're allowed to do on Chol HaMoed because you're saving your investment. And Rabbi Yehuda goes even further and he says you're even allowed to be me'aveh. The word me'aveh means to make thick. And what that really means, the Gemara is going to debate what it means. So we'll get to that in a moment. Next, mocher peros ksus v'kelim mochrim b'tzin l'tzarach hamoed. That if you're a merchant and you're selling things that could be used on the moed, such as produce, clothing, and utensils, you're allowed to sell them, but you should sell them quietly. In other words, don't open up the shop completely like regular. And the Gemara will explain what it means to do it privately, but you're allowed to sell goods as long as it's done privately. And as long as it's l'tzarach hamoed for the needs of the yantiv. Hatzayodin v'hadeshushos v'hagerusos osin b'tzina l'tzarach hamoed. Furthermore, people who are hunters and they trap animals so that there should be fresh meat on yantiv, they can continue their activities. The shushos are people who are cereal makers. When I use the word cereal, I mean crushed grain that's cut up into smaller pieces, like that you would make farina, or you'd make whatever people would make from crushed grain. And the same thing as gerusos is people who crush dried beans to make some kind of bean flour or bean meal. That's the word, right? It's meal, is the correct word. So osin b'tzina l'tzarach hamoed, that also you're allowed to do because it's l'tzarach hamoed, but you got to do it privately. You can't be conspicuous and open up the shop and open up the factory like normal. And Rabbi Yossi Omer heim hechmir al atzma. These professionals were machmir on themselves. What Rabbi Yossi exactly means is also debated in the Gemara. We'll see in just a moment. So first, let's go back to that question of what is the word me'aveh, to make a thick thing, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Pligi bar Rabbi Chia bar Abba v'Rabbi Asi u'taravayu mishmei dechizkiya v'Rabbi Yochanan. The two later Amoraim debated what the earlier Amoraim meant when they explained the Mishnah. What does it mean? Chad Omer mechapen aklushe ma'aven asmuche. The Chad Omer mechapen ben aklushe ben asmuche ma'aven oso kamin kari. So one of the later Amoraim said that the thing that the Tanakama permits is to make only a thin layer of hay to cover the drying fruit. And Rabbi Yehuda is even more makel, and he says you can make a thick layer of hay. That's what he means to say ma'aveh, to make a thick layer of hay, to make it more waterproof, which is more exertion. And the other Amora says, no, that's not what Rabbi Yehuda means when he says to be ma'aveh. To be ma'aveh means it's not talking about the layer of hay. The layer of hay, once we give you a heter to make a layer of hay, it can be thin or thick. There's no distinction. What he's talking about is doing extra work, which is to accumulate all of the drying fruit from the entire rooftop and cluster it all together into one pile, like a pile of grain that is in the granary. And the reason for doing that is that there are really two benefits. Number one, there's less hay that you have to spread out because you've got a vertical pile now instead of just a horizontal pile. But also because the outer layer of the drying fruit is a protective cover to all of the stuff on the inside of the pile. So therefore it's beneficial. But since it involves more exertion, the Tanakama does not permit it, and Reb Yehuda permits it. And Tanya Nami Hachi, we have a brisa to support this latter interpretation. It says, Ma'avin osin osokim in kri diver Reb Yehuda. The brisa says that that's what Reb Yehuda means when he says ma'avet, to make it thick. He's talking about the fruit, to make a thick cluster, a thick pile of fruit is what he's talking about. Next, Mochrei peros ksus bekelim mochrin betzina v'chulei. People who sell produce, clothing, and utensils, as long as it's l'tzarech hamoed and they're doing it privately, it's perfectly okay. And then came along the Mishnah and talked about certain professions like hunting and crushing grain into meal that you're also allowed to do. And Rabbi Yossi said, no, they're machmir. What does the Rabbi Yossi mean? Does Rabbi Yossi telling me that these professionals were machmir not to allow themselves to do it at all? Or maybe Rabbi Yossi is coming to be meichel, and he's coming to tell me as follows. Don't think that you're required to do these things privately. That's only a chumrah that these professionals placed upon themselves. But really, me'ikar hadin, really technically, you're allowed to do it even publicly. There's no restriction since it's l'tzarech hamoed. What is Rabbi Yossi coming to tell me? That is he coming to be machmir or is he coming to be mekel? So Tashma, Mochrei peres ksus v'kelim mochrin betzina l'tzarech hamoed. That look at the Bryce. The Bryce elaborates. It says that you're allowed to sell these things privately for the needs of the moed. But Rabbi Yossi Omer tagori teveria hinechlir al atzma. On that, Rabbi Yossi says that the merchants of Tiberia were machmir on themselves not to sell at all, even privately. So it becomes clear from the language of the Brisa that Rabbi Yossi is telling you a chumrah. He's telling you, I agree that it's permitted to sell privately, but there are certain locales where the merchants and the professionals did not want to do it. Next, that if you're a trapper and you trap animals and birds and fish, you can do it privately, quietly. You can do it on Chol HaMoed if it's l'tzarech hamoed. And on that, Rabbi Yossi Omer tzadei ako henichmiru al atzm shelo yutzadin kol ikar. Rabbi Yossi says the hunters in the city of Akko were machmir and not to allow themselves even to do it privately. And deshushe chilka targis v'tisni doshushin betzina l'tzarech hamoed. And finally, those who crush grain to make it into meal, and chilka, tirgis, and tisni, we'll see, are different grades of cereal. You're allowed to crush those things quietly and privately, l'tzarech hamoed. And Rabbi Yossi Omer, deshushe tzipore, heinechmir al asm shelo yudoshin kol ikar. Those who used to crush grain in tzipore, they would not do it at all. They were machmir on themselves. So Omer Abaya, let's do a translation. We find many times that Abaya is the translator of difficult words in Shas. Chilka chada letarte, tirgis chada letlas, and tisni chada le'arba. He says, what are these different grades of grain, of meal? Chilka is where you take a kernel of grain and you crush it into two pieces. So that's coarse grain, coarse grade cereal. And tirgis is chada litlas. Tirgis is taking a grain and making it a little bit finer granulation by making it into three pieces, one kernel into three pieces. And tisni is the finest granulation when you take one grain and one kernel and you crush it into four pieces. Like, you like kasha? Anyone here eat kasha? I'm a big kasha guy. I grew up with kasha. So you go Wolf's kasha, you buy it at the market. You notice that they have three different levels, three different. You know what I'm talking about? They have the fine gray kasha. They have the medium kasha, and then they have the coarse, the big. Am I from a different? I guess you have to be Russian.
You should say there was a kasha manufacturer.
Your grandfather was it? Really?
The only one, no?
No kidding. So you know exactly what I'm talking about.
No, I did.
But his father was.
Very healthy. Father would know.
Right.
Very healthy for you.
Yeah, it's healthy. Good. Ki asa Rav Dimi Amar, with some varnishkas, right? Ki asa Rav Dimi Amar kunta. So Rav Dimi comes along and he says, That's not the translation of chilka. You translated chilka, tirgis, and tisni as different granulations, and you said that chilka is the coarsest granulation of grain. That's not what chilka means. Chilka is not even talking about wheat, it's talking about spelt, and it's referring to a whole grain spelt. That's what the word chilka means. And you're allowed to process that on Chol HaMoed. So meisvei, chilka, tirgis, v'tisni, tumein b'chol makom. So the question that we're going to raise is that the Brisa says these three things, chilka, tirgis, and tisni, are automatically makabel tumah. If they are exposed to tumah, they become tameh. Now normally unprocessed produce is not makabel tumah. It has to be in its processed form. So bishlam lamando merchada litarti litzlas larba mishamachi tumein b'chol makom dis kashor. If you tell me that it's already crushed grain, it's already been processed, it's been primed for food, so then I can understand why it's makabel tumah. But elalamandamar kunta amai tumein b'chol makam halo iskashor. But if you're telling me that it's whole, the word chilka means whole grain spelled, then why should it be makabel tumah? It hasn't been processed yet. So the Gemara says, no, it is. Kagon de mikalfan. It's been pearled. You know what the word pearled means? When you buy pearled barley, do you ever see that? So what does pearled mean? It means that they take off the outer husk, the outer layer of the grain, to make it so that when you cook it, it'll be nice and soft and chewy. The ilav, the sharalahu b'maya, lo hava mikalfa. And therefore, what is its processing? You have to put it in water. You have to either scald it in water or soak it in water for a period of time in order to be able to pearl it. And that in itself is what primes it to be makabel tumah. Even though it's whole grain, it's still been processed to some degree. V'amai kari le chilka, and that's exactly why they call it chilka, because the word chilka means a portion of. The shakal chilkayo, because a portion of it has been removed. That's what it means to pearl it, that you remove the outer layer. So let's bring another kasha. Hanoder min hadagan asr af b'pula mitzri yavesh umuter balach umuter ba'oris b'chilka v'tirgis v'tisni. If a person takes a netter that I'm not going to eat grain, the word grain implies something that you store in the granary. So what do you store in a granary? You store wheat, grain, and you also store dried beans. Those are things that are traditionally stored in a granary. And therefore, when you take that neder, you're not allowed to eat wheat, and you're not allowed to eat dried beans. But moist beans, like fava beans that you put in your salad, right? Those you're allowed to have, because that's not something that you put in a granary. And furthermore, you're allowed to eat rice, and you're allowed to eat chilka, tirgis, and tisni. Now, bishlam alamandomer chada letarte chada letlas chada le'arba shapir denaf kaluhu mitoras dagan. If you tell me that the definition of chilka, tirgis, and tisni, all three, are different granulations of ground grain, so then I understand why these things are not kept in a granary. You normally only grind them after you take them out of the granary, and therefore when you took a neder that you're not going to eat things that are stored in a granary, you didn't need to include these grades of meal. Kunta dagan ma'al. But if you're telling me that the word chilka means whole grain spelt, so then why is it not something that you store in a granary? It should also be subsumed under your neder, and should be prohibited to you because you took the neder. So the Gemara says kasha. You're right. I don't have a. Here, that doesn't mean kasha the grain. It means kasha. We have a kasha. Okay. Anyway, so Rav Huna shara lehu lahano krupaisa lemeza lezvune ki urchayu b'shuka. Rav Huna permitted these krupaisa. Now Rashi says krupaisa are people who sell spices, but as you'll see, spices doesn't mean spices. It means like condiments. He permitted condiment sellers to sell like their condiments in a normal fashion without any holds barred. Go right ahead, sell it normally. So Eisvei Rav Kahana Chanus Psucha Listav Posech Benol Kedarko Psucha L'Risharabim Posech Echas Benoel Echas. So Rav Kahana says, how can you permit that? We have the Brisa that tells us that if you have a shop, a store that opens up to a side street, that's not conspicuous, so then you can keep it open and the doors can be open normally on Chol HaMoed. But if it opens up to a Rishus Harabim, if it's out in the middle of the shuk, then you have to keep one door closed to show that it's not the normal business operation. How can you allow these condiment sellers to do normal business operations? Ve'erev Yom Tov ha'acharon shel Chag motzi mater shuki ha'ir beperos so bishvil kavod Yom Tov ha'acharon. And it's only on the last day of Chol HaMoed, like Hoshana Rabbah, let's say, that you can completely open up all the shops and adorn the marketplace with all different kinds of produce, so that people will be able to make purchases for Shmini Atzeres, for the last day of Yontif. So you see, it's only permitted to do this conspicuous kind of mercantile trade of goods only on the last day of Chol HaMoed for the sake of Shmini Atzeres, but to do it all days of Chol HaMoed, you see, is not permitted. So the Gemara answers, Lo kasha ha-beperi ha-betavlin. The answer is that there's two different kinds of produce. There's a produce that it's not self-evident that it's for the needs of Chol HaMoed. Let's say dried grain. When you buy dried grain, it could be you're buying it for 2 weeks from now. And therefore, we restrict you on the way that you're allowed to sell it. It shouldn't be sold conspicuously. But what Rav Huna was permitting these condiment sellers to sell were things that are perishable. Like where Rashi says they sell cabbage and they sell cress. They sell vegetables that are used as condiments for the main dish, but if you don't eat them right away, they're going to spoil. So because it was self-evident that they were L'tzarech HaMoed, even on the first and second day of Chol HaMoed, he permitted them to sell them conspicuously. Let's go on to the next parak. We'll just do the Mishnah. Ve'elu megalchin b'moed. The following people are allowed to get a haircut and shave on Chol HaMoed. Habami medinas hayam umibeis hashivya. If a person had a mishap, and his boat was late, and he couldn't get off the boat until Chol HaMoed, so there was no opportunity for him to do it before, so he's allowed to get a shave on Chol HaMoed. If a person comes from a Beis HaShiva, Beis HaSurin, if a person was in captivity, he was held captive, or he just got out of prison, also, because they couldn't do it before, we allow them to do it on Chol HaMoed. V'hamenuda she'irtiu lo chachamim, or if a person was put in Chayrim. When the person is in Nidoy in Chayrim, he's not allowed to get a haircut as part of the sort of the mourning process of being in Chayrim. So if let's say the rabbis took him out of Chayrim, mitten Chol HaMoed, he's allowed to get a haircut. Or if a person took a neder that he's not going to shave and cut his hair, and then he gets a hataras nedarim on Chol HaMoed, then too he's allowed to, because he couldn't do it before. Or if a person is a nazir or a mitzora and the purification process ends on Chol HaMoed, that's the first time they can get a haircut, and therefore they have to do it.
What if a person loses parnasa by having messy hair? I mean, like some people say that.
Right. Okay. So there's discussions in the poskim. You're familiar with the halacha about shaving on Chol HaMoed, just like shaving during Sfira and during the 3 weeks. Yeah. One has to be very circumspect before he gives a heter for Chol HaMoed. It's probably more machmir than both Sfira and the 3 weeks. But if you really feel that it's going to compromise your parnasa, so then we do give you a heter. Mishum hefsid hitiru, right? Anytime there's a financial loss, the rabbis suspended all of the restrictions of Chol HaMoed. Ve'elu mechabsin b'moed. And the following people, now, so the first part was talking about getting haircuts. Now we're going to talk about doing laundry. Very similar, but there's with certain slight differences. So all of the same thing. So all of those people are the same. If you had a mishap, you couldn't arrive on time into the city, and you come on Chol HaMoed, or you just got out of captivity, or you just got out of prison, or you just had your chayrim removed from the chachamim, or if a person got a hataras nedarim because he took a neder that he wasn't going to do laundry, or and so all of those cases you're allowed to do the laundry on Chol HaMoed. And what are you allowed to launder? Matfechos hayadayim umatfechos hasfarim umatfechos hasfag. That you're allowed to launder handkerchiefs, covers for books. They used to, like Rashi says in another place, they are used to cover books. But another explanation that's brought down from another Rashi is matfechos saparim. The barbers have the what do you call it? I don't know. The cloth, the barber's cloth that he puts over you to prevent the hair from getting in your clothes. And matfechos asfag, that these are sponges or sponge-like washcloths that are used for bathhouses. for a person to wash himself. So those are things that you're allowed to launder. Hazavin v'hazavos v'hanidos v'halyoldos v'chol ha'olin mituma l'tahara harelu mutarin. And in addition to those aforementioned people that were unable to do the laundry before, we also permit a person who's becoming tahor for the first time, and they need these personal fabrics in order to be able to handle them in a state of tahara. They just went to mikvah, and now they have all of this dirty laundry that's tameh, and they need to be matahiret so that they can use it now. They're allowed to launder them and put them in the mikvah on Chol HaMoed. Ushar kol adam asurin, but anyone else besides the ones on this list for personal use, they're not allowed to, because they should have prepared enough towels and handkerchiefs and things like that before the Yontif. And we'll continue along this discussion.